You're listening to Breakpoint This Week, where we're talking about the top stories of the week from a Christian perspective. Today we're going to reflect on 9/11 and the way different generations view that event. We're also going to talk about the scandal of immigration and what it means when small towns like Springfield, Ohio, see a huge influx of migrants. So we have a lot to get to today. We're so glad you're with us. Stick around. Welcome to Breakpoint This Week. From the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm Maria Baer, alongside John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. John, earlier this week, of course, was 9/11. I heard a beautiful story on the world and everything in it about the flag ceremony that they do at Pepperdine University. They've done this for several years now, where they put up, I think, almost 3,000 full-sized American flags, one for each victim that died on 9/11, and they bring in speakers, and it sounds really powerful. I'd love to see that. My university always set up a field full of the miniature flags on 9/11, and that was really impactful too. I always spend the day every year just reading some. I return to a couple essays that I've read over the years. One is in the New York Times, and there was an ESPN piece about a college lacrosse player who saved several people in, I think, the South Tower. That's really impactful. And just kind of think through those things and rewatch them every year. And I was talking to my kids about it this year. And do you do anything in particular to sort of commemorate it, which is a weird way of putting it, but just to meditate on it, I guess?
You know, I do many years. This year, I was traveling. So, you know, reading articles and reading reflections on it. The two things that I seem to come back to each year, one is there's an article from years ago, and it's now turned into a book, and the book is my recommendation, but the article is worth it as well. It's called The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11. And basically in a chronological order from that day, it kind of reflects, or it quotes and just allows people to speak for themselves. It pulls quotes, what people were saying, what people and various reflections at various places. And it also follows the president's Air Force One as he goes to various places and how people are responding. And it's just really a remarkable article. It's what was put together and then put into a time sequence is incredible. The other is there's an audio transcript of the call from Todd Beamer from Flight 93.
Yeah.
And his conversation with a woman named Lisa, who was the 911 operator that he reached. The process of realizing the situation that they were in there on Flight 93 and the decision that was made. Lisa was is also the name of his wife, his widow. And so there's just a lot of details there. This year, though, I saw something and I wanted to start talking about it. It brought so many things to mind. An article in Slate this year, I don't have the title of it. I think it was Slate. I'm pretty sure it was Slate. Talked about how Gen Zers, and of course, we've now entered the time where there's a lot of young people who don't have memories of 9/11, right? I mean, we're talking now of over 20 years. Next year will be the 25th anniversary, I think, right? 2001. Oh no, 2026 will be. Yeah. So we're at 23 years, and talked about how there's a generation online, but of course this is how this younger generation communicates, is all online, that has turned 9/11 into a meme, into a punchline, into that's my 9/11 when something hard or irritating happens in their life. And the article went on to say, it's okay. This is how they have to deal with it. And I've been thinking about that a lot on a number of levels. But what's your initial reaction to that?
I mean, I guess my initial reaction is kids are kids. I feel annoyed at the therapizing of like, well, this is how they're emotionally dealing with the news of this happening.
There's a lot of that in that article.
I'm sure there is. Yeah, so that bothers me. I feel like if I heard a kid doing, I'm a recess monitor at my kid's school. And last year, I remember one day, rainy day, indoor recess, these third grade boys were building this huge Lego tower. And then I slowly realized that they were like then having pretend planes fly into them, and they were reenacting 9/11. And I talk to them about it. I was like, I don't think this is the right way to talk about this kind of thing, but they weren't necessarily being irreverent, I guess. You know what I mean? I guess it depends on the age of the kid or whatever, but I hate the idea of this being reduced to anything less than what it was.
Well, these are 20 somethings,
Yeah.
Not, I guess you're talking about an elementary kid, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Third grade.
Yeah. So the first thing that it brought to mind was years ago, I hosted a forum at the college that I taught at in Tennessee, and we did a conversation on race, and we had a black young leader from Chattanooga who led ministries at a church come and speak. We had the academic vice president from the school speak, and there was somebody else. I can't actually. Can't remember who the other person was in this forum. But anyway, and these were well attended on this campus for the size of the school, and they were ways to have what I thought were important conversations that we weren't having on campus. And in the middle of the forum, 3 students, I didn't know they were students at the time, came into the forum dressed in hoods, white hoods. One had a bat, one had a chain, and one had a bar or some other kind of weapon. They were dressed like the KKK and interrupted a forum on race on a college campus. I was so stunned, didn't know what to do. The moderator of the forum at the time, who wasn't me for the first time, it was actually one of my students. He jumped up and stiff-armed the first one and said, "Get out of here," which I thought was super impressive because he wasn't that big of a guy. And the guys took off. And so I chased them down, which, anybody who knows me knows that I only run if a basketball is involved, and I chased these guys down. And I was so mad, and I said, "What on earth?" I might not have used the word earth, was that? And they said, "We just thought it was a joke. We just wanted to be funny." And there is a book written years ago by a guy named Thomas Hibbs called Shows About Nothing, and it talked about the move of television towards nihilism. And specifically Seinfeld, of course, is the classic one where you take things that are sacred and you make fun of them. Now, of course, we've moved beyond that in a lot of ways. Like you can never get away with that Seinfeld episode of not wearing the ribbon sort of thing today, or, not that there's anything wrong with that, because there's these sacred topics that you're never supposed to make fun of. But there are things that you're still allowed to make fun of, right? And I think you can tell a lot about a culture by what you laugh at in a culture. And I'm not talking about like the American culture because not everybody agrees on it. I'm talking about kind of subcultures. When we confronted these 3, now that, again, these weren't elementary kids. They were all college freshmen. 2 of them quickly just repented and were like, "Oh man, I'm sorry." One of them did not. And his parents got mad at the school. It was a dean of students at the school who was a black man who stood up and said, "I don't want them to be expelled." Now you can think, if you interrupted a forum on race with weapons in your hand today, dressed like the KKK. Oh yeah. You're gone. There's not even this. But really what concerned me was that kind of thing of what's funny. So anyway, saw this article and started to think, I don't think we ever talked about Pearl Harbor that way. I don't think we ever talked about the assassination of JFK. That's time-wise, it's a little bit longer, 41 to, the 80s. We're talking about 40 years there. JFK was a little bit closer. What are the Challenger disaster? Maybe there was jokes about the Challenger disaster that were made, but this was so much, 9/11 was so much bigger. So I'm with you. Like, I don't want to kind of get away from kids will be kids and this is immature and that sort of thing. They weren't talking about teenagers, by the way. They were talking about 20 somethings. And I've talked for a long time about the cult of adolescence. And, we're calling them kids will be kids when we're talking about 16, 17, 18, in this case, 20, 22-year-olds. In other cultural settings, they're leading battles. They're managing entire farms, right? They're not kids. They're not let off the hook, in other times and in other places. But it just seemed, I was just trying to bring parallels. Like I remember once in junior high, I was just, doodling, and I sketched a swastika on my thing. And it's just because I had seen the symbol. I didn't know about it. I didn't know the history of it. I may have heard. And a classmate saw it, told my mom, and she was just like, you don't understand. You don't do this. And it was like, oh, I don't do this. Like, of course I don't do it. But it was a disconnect for me, you know? And then I realized, like, I'm so glad for that lesson. These things, there's something about this that's historically sacred. But the scale of 9/11 and the way that it's always been talked about, I just don't get this. They're treating it as a punchline. I don't know. Maybe I'm doing the get off my lawn old fogey thing here. I don't know.
There was a piece I read this week that was incredible by a woman who writes for the New Yorker, but this was on her Substack. She's not a Christian believer, but her piece was called "Everyone is Numbing Out." I just want to read a little part of it. Life has gotten very chaotic incredibly quickly. It's become increasingly difficult to parse anything from the static. People started coping with a lack of meaning through a kind of ironic detachment, which is very much still around, but it has now matured into a pervasive cultural apathy, a permeating numbness. This isn't nihilism per se. Even nihilists have a sincere belief system. They just sincerely believe that life is meaningless. What we're dealing with is worse than nihilism. People are checking out of life in their 20s and 30s without reaching any profound conclusion about the point of it all.
But doesn't this go to, we talk so much about the parable of the madman. I spoke to a group of community leaders the other day and talked about that. The upward, sideward, downward in all directions because the earth has been unchained from its sun. And Nietzsche talking about this kind of existential dread that was destined for Western culture. And I just feel like that's, again, I'll repeat what I've said 1,000 times here. That was theoretical. We used to theorize about meaninglessness without God because you had the existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre who were trying to pose that, oh, you can just make your own meaning. And we're just like, you can't make your own meaning if whatever you make is meaningless, right? You can't make meaning out of meaninglessness. But it's one thing to theorize about it. It's another thing to feel that existential dread. And I do think that that's part of this, right? Because what you choose to laugh at, how you choose to laugh at it matters, right? Whether you choose to laugh at it in a self-deprecating way or you choose to be a mocker. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago, didn't we? Like the difference between a seeker and a mocker. And if there's a generation moving towards mocking. Now, I'll say that I run into young people all the time. I was up at Hillsdale College this week. I spoke to a group up there of students that were part of the Equip Ministries. What a great, thing that they're doing up there, and the seriousness of that campus. But I also spoke to an administrator who told me about some of the pranks the boys' dorms do against each other, and they're serious, but they're seriously meaningful, And Hillsdale's campus has all these statues of, it's kind of really cool. And one of my daughter's friends talked about how they play statue golf. They have, golf with the little balls and you hit it, Thomas Jefferson's hole 7.
Trying to hit Margaret Thatcher. Yeah.
Yeah. Thatcher's there. But it's like, I guess I don't find that at all in this category. That's not being trivial, especially because a lot of those kids, you can say, who is that? And they know they not only know that that's a statue of Margaret Thatcher, they can tell you who Margaret Thatcher is or was. That's completely different, I think, than the mockery. And I've thought about this really since that incident at this other college in Tennessee, that there's just, and again, that was a one-off. These were just 3 kids. They weren't at any level representative of the student body. And the leadership at that time, I thought, handled that incident incredibly. We were in a part of the country where the KKK had meetings, where this is. Again, back to the theme that, all these Christian colleges were founded in the middle of nowhere so kids couldn't sin. I think we talk all the time here about how do you read culture? How do you understand culture? And there's so much in the news this week. And I'm talking about the topic that came up in the debate about Springfield, Ohio and Aurora, Colorado, that has been, widely dismissed and now fact-checked the fact-checked. But a lot of this has to do with the strength and the robustness of our culture. And, we've talked here about the strength of mediating institutions in a culture, de Tocqueville's view that America was really robust in the middle. And that's a sign of cultural strength. I think I don't want to say a lack of seriousness, but a lack of meaning. I think you hit it. I think that's what it is. It's just really hard to have a robust, resilient culture that way. I don't know. It was just a stunning piece to see not only that this is happening, but justifying that this is happening, mocking 9/11.
I think the last thing I'll say is that I'm less worried about using humor, just because if somebody is saying oh, I was broken up with and that's my 9/11, or these kids are making stupid jokes like that, the joke exists in part because of the seriousness of 9/11. As irreverent as that might be, if they actually didn't think 9/11 mattered or was serious, then that's not a funny joke, right? At some level, good comedy relies on what's true. It's like when the Babylon Bee made Rachel Levine their Man of the Year after, that's funny because this person says they're a woman, right? So there's some acknowledging of the truth that comes in comedy. I'm more concerned, I'm in my freshman, one of my journalism classes in college, and this is 4 years after 9/11. And one of my first papers I have to write is, did the American media do enough to really reckon with what our country had done to inspire 9/11? That is way more concerning to me than kids, even 20-something brats, trying to be funny about it.
I completely agree with that. And there were a lot of that. I remember when Richard Gere got up at a 9/11 tribute event right after and had a moment of silence for this terrorist. I mean, it was crazy. I don't think this is Babylon Bee humor. I think I am a fan of humor, and by no means do I want to say, look, we can't. Humor doesn't play a role in how we deal with tragedy and all of that sort of stuff. I mean, that's Shakespeare, right? That's what a comedy is. It's basically looking at it. And
Viktor Frankl talked about that, about making light of the camps. Yeah.
I think this is different. I don't think that there is, at least as it was described. And I know I threw this on you this morning and you didn't get a chance to read the piece. I didn't sense at any level the seriousness being taken here.
Okay.
And it was just almost like some of the examples anyway were melodramatic, the intentional melodramatics of social media, right? Where first world problems hashtag. And then
okay, so the tone is
you see what I mean? It was a different tone.
Our parents lied about how serious this was, and let's make fun of that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I would even say that, the people think about Bill Maher, or somebody who also got in trouble for comments after 9/11, missing the good guys and the bad guys in that and kind of getting it completely upside down. Same thing that's happened with Israel and Hamas. Take the protesters against Israel, the pro-Hamas protesters on college campus. They're taking the event seriously. They're just completely morally upside down. And that to me is different than that meaninglessness. So, but I think it goes back then to why do they think this way? They certainly have heard 9/11 referenced. Are we not teaching 9/11? Are we not teaching? I mean, I know we're not teaching civics, right? There is
we know that.
Yeah, right. And that plays into, I think, the conversation about even the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. So let's go there.
Obviously, this was brought up during the debate this week, the presidential debate, and is a big topic in both of our states. So I live about 40 minutes outside of Springfield, where there's been a huge influx of Haitian immigrants. And you live, an hour from Aurora, where there's been a huge influx of Venezuelan immigrants, I believe. So how do you want to tackle this conversation? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I know it came up in the debate. It was particularly they're eating our cats, they're eating our dogs.
Right.
That'll be a quote for generations to come.
Years to come.
There was a quick fact check, and of course that's another part of the debate. I don't know if I want to talk about the debate or not, but we're not sure who won, but we're pretty sure all of us lost the debate. You know, it's kind of that one of those things when you saw it between the moderators and the president and, you know, the inability to answer questions on the other side. I mean, it was there were 3 sets of participants and they all failed. That's my take on that's
Nellie Bowles at the Free Press this morning said, Kamala won handily. Sorry, I call him like I see him. But she said, man, she just fielded those questions like an impressionist painter. More a suggestion of a thing than the thing itself.
Yeah, that's a great line. What a great line. No, absolutely true. I mean, but, you know, again, we're not a political podcast specifically, although we get accused of being that. But here's my connection with the first topic. I don't remember which hurricane it was. We were talking about disaster and disaster relief. And one of the aspects when you think about that is that there's communities in which there's a natural disaster and it decimates.
You're talking about Haiti?
Well, you could talk about Haiti. You could talk about different parts that were affected by the 2004 tsunami. You could talk about,
sure.
you know, other places. Then there are communities where even a worse natural disaster hits. And it doesn't do as much. It's not decimating. It's hard. It's disastrous. Maybe people even lose their lives, which is always, you know, an immense tragedy. But it has to do with the infrastructure, and infrastructure is an expression of culture. And I was thinking about that this week, and even this morning, because you and I had, you know, spent some time offline talking about this and trying to figure out how do we think and talk about this. Mm-hmm. Is there an embellishment happening on social media of what's happening in Springfield? Probably. Is absolutely nothing happening? Well, no. I mean, the mayor of Aurora has admitted that there are apartment complexes that have been taken over. There are police reports now that we have seen, or, you know, calls that have been, you know, released in which Haitian immigrants are taking geese from the park, you know, and so on. And, you know, we could talk about the specifics. It's super interesting to me that people are far more outraged by losing pets than losing actual citizens, which we've had with illegal immigrants, you know, committing crimes. That tells you something about our pet culture. But more than that, a robust culture can handle more disruption, if that makes sense. And I think we're just, you know, at the very front. I know there's more to talk about than that. But when you don't have a resilience to your culture, when it's not strong and robust, then these things I think this says a lot about us, not just about the influx of immigrants and the lack of control on the southern border, which is obvious. And then when the response is, you can't shut down the border because that's unloving or unjust or, you know, welcome the stranger, you know, you get these kind of evangelical platitudes thrown around. It just doesn't take seriously, A, the real world, or B, the Christian worldview of how we understand and think about nations. And of course, on one spectrum, you've got the super push, like you know, God has determined this nation, and, you know, that you know, and kind of a hyper nationalist view. And on the other hand, you've got the, you know, there's no such things as nations, and now one of those things are true from a Christian perspective. So I that's the thing that came to mind when I, you know, watching both the run up, you know, and the reports of what's happening specifically in Springfield. The Aurora story is a little bit older, and then coming out of the debate, and, you know, Trump getting immediately fact checked, and then basically the response is because it wasn't what he said, therefore there's no problem whatsoever in Springfield, which clearly the residents of Springfield, they don't feel that way, right? I mean, they don't feel that way at all.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing about the debate, like you said, I mean, it's kind of enabled everybody now to just focus on this one soundbite and whether this is or isn't happening. I tend to think that it is probably closer to the truth than farther. And at some point, we're going to, you know, find out more concrete evidence and stories, because we're not talking about rumors. We're talking about people in Springfield testifying at city council meetings or whatever it is. So that's, you know, this is going to be provable one way or another. But the thing I think is really worth talking about is that immigration in like Springfield, unfortunately, has unwittingly become a case study in this, where you can say lots of platitudes and talk about the theory of whether we should welcome people from other nations and how we should talk about them and treat them. And then you can let the rubber meet the road and realize that so much of this is a numbers issue. Springfield has been a dwindling town since the heyday of, factory manufacturing in this country. And it's a very sweet town, but it's a little depressing to drive through. I have a good friend who used to live there that I would visit pretty regularly. And there's all these gorgeous big Victorian houses downtown that are just completely abandoned or run down. I mean, there's so many towns in America that are like this right now. They had a population of around 60,000 people, I think was the last tally. And starting about 4 years ago, but my friends in Springfield are saying it's really been in the last 18 months, 20,000 people from Haiti have gone to this town. And there's lots of disagreement and hand-wringing over who brought them in. Was it the actual companies that have factories there that were looking for cheap labor, or was it the government, or what? I'm not really I don't know. I'm not really interested in that for the purposes of this discussion. The fact is, you can't bring in 20,000 people who don't speak the language, don't have anywhere to live, and don't have a means of making money when they arrive, and expect there not to be chaos. So the public schools do not have enough room for that amount of kids all at once. They also don't have enough translators to translate into the Creole. The hospitals can't deal with this amount of people. There's also been outbreaks of diseases we don't usually see there, such as TB and HIV among children. It just overruns the system itself. And that has to be a part. You're naive if you think this is just a conversation about who likes who and what stereotypes we put. This is not helping the immigrants either. Nobody's really arguing about the fact that they're coming here with government benefits, right? So something's happening. They're here technically legally, but they're on temporary status, which basically means they're let in and then given some nebulous future court date that will or won't come. And so they're just here. This isn't kind to them or to the people in Springfield.
Yeah. And I think a key part of what you just said was not, it can't handle 20,000 more people. It can't handle 20,000 more people who can't speak the language. And there hasn't been some sort of intentionality to enculturate. If you ever visited Ellis Island, which I did with my daughter, I've only been there once, but it is a remarkable monument to the incredible numbers that had came into the United States, over this certain period of time. And it describes, listen, the conditions weren't always great. And of course, many of these folks dealt with racism and things like that when they came and settled in various cities. But there was a level of intentionality to, okay, here's what it means to be an American. And when you do that, then it clarifies kind of an identity. Now, I'm not saying here that what it means to be an American is inherently better because we're Americans than being a Haitian because they're Haitian. Well, I'm not talking about ethnicity. I'm talking about culture. And culture itself comes from the word to cultivate. There's an identity that's cultivated. And it also, as Chuck Colson often pointed out, the root word is the same as the word cult, which I'm not talking about, kind of the creepy cults that share wives and things like that. I'm talking about the idea of worship, your fundamental belief system. Or as he used to also talk about culture being kind of the flesh, the public expression of our worldview. And listen, there is a dramatic difference in culture between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's the same piece of land, and it's not that big. It's the same thing as North Korea and South Korea. You're talking about a vastly different understanding of life in the world. And now, I think it's completely legitimate to say that some understandings of life in the world are true and better, and some are not. None of them are fully true, but they all approach truth differently. I had this conversation years ago. Shout out to our board member who lives in Chattanooga. He years ago lined up a speaking engagement at this boys' prep school, and I spoke in chapel and spoke in classes, and I was sitting at lunch across the table from a teacher who was disturbed by how I talked about worldview, I guess, because he said, you seem to be saying that some cultures are better than others. I said, I'm absolutely saying that some cultures are better than others. He goes, you can't say that. I said, I just did. He goes, well, what do you mean? And I borrowed a line from an apologist who said, cultures that love their neighbors are better than cultures that eat their neighbors. And we have expressions of both throughout history. There's a lot to be said about the history of Haiti, the history of slavery there, the history of voodoo there. and how it went completely different than almost every other Caribbean nation that you can actually look at. There's a lot to be said about America. To my former point, America does not now cultivate a foundational belief system. And I would say, originally we were pretty intentional. And I'm not saying that America's God's chosen nation or anything like that, but it is mistelling history to say that there wasn't kind of an intentionality by most states and most authorities throughout history to cultivate at least a Judeo-Christian ethic and a Judeo-Christian framing of the world. Right now, we're not cultivating any framing of the world except for, what Carl Trueman has identified as expressive individualism. You do you. So you're talking about a weak culture in-house, and you're talking about now, because we don't think worldview is at the root of how we think about what it means to be human and what it means to live life together. We don't cultivate that in those who do cross the borders. And then you add the sheer masses, right? In other words, America handled, if you go back to the sheer masses that came in through San Francisco and that came in through New York, the numbers are staggering. And there was conflict then. There were problems then. But America was able to handle it even better because we took things like belief systems seriously, because we even took our own. Look, it's one thing to not cultivate a identity and kind of demand a conformity to this is what it means to be part of the American project right now. If you're coming through our borders, it's another thing to not have that in its citizens, which we haven't had for a long time. I heard a super left-leaning politician this week say, we need civics education. Os Guinness has been saying it for years. We need civics education. So, to talk about it being a perfect storm, we could handle the numbers better if we saw the world differently. And we're not seeing the world the way that it truly is. And we're not expecting others to. And I think that's the real conflict. Now, the details about they're eating our cats, they're eating our dogs. I agree with you. We'll find out, we'll see what happens. But wow.
Yeah. And I think this is both about consensus and then also about like the ideology of the consensus. So it's one thing to say like we should promote good ideas and not bad ideas. And it's another thing to say, it's also important that we all sort of have the same general idea of what our social contract is. Like there has to be some level of consensus. And that's part of what's missing.
Yeah, that's all I'm
now.
saying. And right. It's not just whether we're all Christian or not. It's, nations have identities and we're not the only ones, look across the pond, European nations.
Oh, and when Americans travel, and we're very happy to teach each other and our college students, like when you go to another country, you respect their customs and you expect this and don't expect that and whatever. It's like that's a meme too. We get made fun of for being ignorant of other cultures when we travel elsewhere. But this past week, I was in a training for a really, really cool ministry here called Village Ministries that does basically respite care for families in crisis. So they actually said over 90% of the families they help are single moms who have a medical emergency, and where normally because they don't have any community here for whatever reason, their kids end up in the foster care system when there's no abuse or neglect. There's really no reason other than that the mom is temporarily incapacitated. So this ministry comes in and trains families, does all the background checking and everything to be able to take care of kids whose moms are birthing another kid or having some kind of emergency for a little while. So I'm in this training for this week. And one of the people running the ministry was talking about this woman, she was just giving an example of this family that they were helping a couple months ago. And she said, we really encourage churches to embrace these families in crisis. And she said, so I was bringing this meal to this woman who had never been a part of a church community, really didn't have any family in the area, was just really, really isolated. And when I came up to her door to bring her this meal, her reaction was reasonable if you think about the situation she's in. She was like, what is that? Like very wary. Like, I don't know. Why are you bringing this to me? What are you asking for from me? And she said, it took a minute for me to say, I just want to give this to you. We want to help you. We are Christians. We're doing this. And then pretty quickly, again, reasonably, the relationship turned to this woman in crisis calling the ministry and saying, can I have some money? Can I have this? Can I have that? Can I have that? This has nothing to do with this mom's character or value or worth as a human being. This is, if you think about it, a completely reasonable response given the milieu that she's in. She's never had a Christian community. She's never had help like this. So she's trying to make sense of it from one step to the next. If you bring in 20,000 people from a disastrous home life, like just absolute devastation in Haiti, and you hand them whatever it is, 25,000 US dollars towards their housing, and you say, we're going to hook you up with a job and housing, and healthcare is free, and here you go. And you don't talk about any of the, like you're saying, like the American civics of like, so here it's important. We place value on working for yourself. And the language here is English, and we will try to get translators for you to help you, but it's going to be expected that you learn that just for ease and logistical reasons. And unless you do that, there's going to be a very reasonable and rational reaction that's like, well, you gave me my house and everything else, and you didn't tell me anything about what you expect from me. So can I have more? Can I have more? And I'm not going to do anything for that. I don't know that completely is happening in Springfield right now, but that is a reasonable way to proceed when the situation is what it is without teaching those civics.
No, it is. And it's what most nations do, and look, I'm sure of those 20,000 Haitians, there are wonderful families that have come.
Of course.
And, because and probably have really strong values about family and so on. I mean, we have different communities here in Colorado Springs. My wife and I have been involved with a particular family for a while, and none of this is about, we don't want any of these folks here. In fact, I would say to the hyper nationalists completely, like, we don't want to take any right now kind of people. There's an awful lot of folks coming into the country who have a deep committed faith, and they're going to align, with us on values of family, on values of children, on values of marriage and fidelity, and have a respect for that sort of thing. But you got to vet that. I mean, you have to expect that, and you have to review for that, and that's what has been gone. And part of it is, I think, as a culture, we have become so materialist that we think that the only factor here is money.
Stuff.
And and so if we provide them the stuff, then all will be well. And that's not true of Americans. It's certainly not true of those coming into America.
Yeah. John, let's talk about the debate. I'm just kidding. I actually have to confess, I did not watch it. I was actually at that event with Voices Against Anti-Semitism, which was a really, really neat event. And then I also just kind of didn't have the energy for it afterwards. And I figured I'll see the important quote unquote moments on, online. People will tweet about it or whatever else. But I do know that both candidates were asked and spoke at length about abortion. And so I want to throw it to you because I know you had some concerns about the way the issue, not only their answers, but the way the issue was characterized.
I did watch it. And I also hosted an event that night too, up in Michigan, our Lighthouse Voices event, which is another recommendation. When that video goes online with Samuel James, he did a tremendous job about digital liturgies. And we had a great crowd. I was kind of worried, I made a joke how, ours was the most important conversation happening in America right now, there. But, anyway, the abortion issue came up very quickly. And I think what really needs to be said right up front is, again, the misinformation that was communicated needs to be corrected. And I think pro-lifers need to be really, really clear about this. And part of that is because when there were things that were said by President Trump that were immediately fact-checked, in which what he said actually was either true or not false in the way that the fact checkers, which by the way, they were moderators. They weren't supposed to be fact checkers, but they did that to him. And then things that the candidate Harris said that just flat out weren't true and were not fact checked. For example, that women going through miscarriages couldn't get health care. That is not what the overturning of Roe v. Wade did. That is not what the state laws that were triggered or put into place after Roe have done. That is just not the case. Basically refusing to answer whether she was willing to limit abortion limit late-term abortions. And she basically said that there wasn't 7th, 8th, and 9th month abortions in under Roe, which flat out isn't true, and it still is here. I know this because it's Colorado. I had a conversation this week with someone whose husband is a ER doc and has had 2 patients in the last year come in and ask for 9 abortions in the 9th month. Unwilling, obviously, to provide that, the hospital sends these 2 women across the street in this particular town in Colorado, where they have just set up a late-term abortion clinic with a famous late-term abortionist running the show. When President Trump said that there were babies being slaughtered after birth, that's not exactly correct, but the denial by the moderator to say that there's no late-term after birth abortions happening in the U.S. Vice presidential nominee Tim Walz signed a bill in Minnesota denying care to babies born alive. And it's been documented, at least 8 cases of babies born alive. 5 of them received no care whatsoever. 3 received comfort care. This according to the live action reports on this. All 8 of them died. That is late-term abortion. When he quoted Governor Northam of Virginia, he called it West Virginia. That's where he should have been fact-checked. It was Virginia. This was the previous governor of Virginia, basically saying that's what we want here. We want, if a baby is born alive after a botched abortion, we set the baby aside and then decide what we're going to do with it. I mean, that's the language of what do you call it? After birth? I mean, that's an accurate term for it, although even then it's a euphemism for essentially withholding care from a living, breathing human being outside of the womb. So all of these things were repeated. President Trump was asked about IVF. He called it fertility 3 times. It was a weird thing. He's like, I'm for fertility. I'm for fertility. I don't know what he meant by that, because not all fertility treatments are the same. Vice presidential candidate Tim Walz claims that his fertility treatment with his family was IVF. It wasn't. It was fertility treatment that no pro-lifer has any qualms or hesitations about whatsoever. Process of stimulating the ovaries to produce eggs, as I understand it, and doesn't involve the creation of excess embryos. IVF, as currently practiced, and President Trump now has said that he will have a, taxpayer funded. Look, that is the same kind of HHS mandate that was sued under the Obama administration. I imagine will be sued if President Trump is elected again and he tries to do that, because this is not fertility. IVF is actually leading to the death of more whole human beings at an early stage of development called embryos than abortion, than what we call abortion does, and as has been and as is currently practiced. So it's an unregulated industry, and it's not accurate to call it fertility. So the fact checking that should have happened around the abortion issue didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And there's no other way forward than to kind of, articulate that. This is what was claimed. It ain't true. This is what the truth is around these issues and these claims. And I think I covered them all, but I may have missed some others.
I'm going to pretend to be an alien just dropped into the discourse and ask, why are we as a country so obsessed with this issue? Demographically, it's a relatively small-ish segment of the population that is a woman of childbearing age, right?
Yeah.
Why does this dominate so many of our political conversations?
Yeah, because we are late stream or downstream in kind of the late age of the sexual revolution, in which our technology has enabled our ideas and the fundamental idea of sexual autonomy. And we will do all kinds of flip-flops on sexuality that we won't do on any other issue. Case in point, Kristen Dumais, a professor at a Christian college in the United States this week, and justifying abortion, was doing these kind of parsements around when an embryo is ensouled, is what, ensouled, ENSOUL. In other words, we don't know when the soul enters the body. So even if she's right, which, by the way, the Bible draws no distinction between the body and the soul in that way. That is a Gnostic position, historically understood. These conversations certainly were being had before, philosophically, before we had any sort of understanding of fertilization and of course, that's the group that says, follow the science, follow the science. Well, let's follow the science. The science of embryology says when conception happens, a new human being is created. So to draw a distinction between a human being and a human being that doesn't have a soul yet, shouldn't we err at the very best in caution? And based on that same arrangement, should we then fiddle around with when people lose a certain degree of memory or a certain degree of capacity or something like that because of a disease or old age, then we should, off them in order to quote unquote be compassionate? That's what needs to be recognized here. This isn't secular voices like Kamala Harris and others that are just saying this. You have quote unquote evangelical voices that are doing flip-flops to justify this, using theoretical theology that is completely ignoring the science, which they're telling us to follow. And yes, I'll say the evangelical history of this in the 20th century was mixed, and some of it was wrong. Some of the great Christian thinkers got this wrong. And thank God for Francis Schaeffer coming over and getting it right and pushing the evangelical church to get it right and to catch up with the Roman Catholics on this. The sort of flip-flopping we do is what happens when you are captivated by the political illusion. The critique has been the right has been captivated by the political illusion, and some have. But the evangelical left right now, I know we weren't specifically talking about the evangelical left, but they have been captivated by the political illusion every bit as much or more. And you see it when, in order to justify a political position, they do this sort of theological wrangling that they don't do on any other issue.
The only other thing I want to say about that is that, in my experience, women who are actually dealing with crisis pregnancies, like if you want to be outraged on their behalf or you want to be concerned about their wants and needs, then be outraged about the normalcy, the cultural normalcy and accepting of men abandoning them. That is their chief concern 99% of the time, is that the man involved in their life has either abandoned them or is pressuring them to get an abortion. So if you want to talk about what women need and want, go that route. And that's where I'll believe you that you deeply care about this issue. Women who come into the crisis pregnancy center where I volunteer are not asking me when their child's soul entered its body. They're telling me that the man who got them pregnant is uninvolved or is pressuring them to end the pregnancy. It's a really important point. And none of that justifies the woman's own decision to commit sexual sin or to go down this path, that the decision to abort a child is not justified by someone else's sin against you. And I know you believe that. Anecdotally, the stories that I heard this week about 9 abortions in the 9th month that's happening in Colorado, and this is just a single doctor at a single hospital. So multiply that times however many doctors at however many hospitals and ER rooms, across the state. And that's the story. We were going to have this child. He left me. I don't want it now. And that's not just anecdotes, by the way. We now statistically know this, right? Where there has been some, at least attempts to approach data of 60 to 70% of women who've had abortions point to that as a factor. And this is Frederica Matthews Green, absolutely accurate line from the Marriage Project years ago, or the Family Project years ago, where she said, women were promised autonomy. What they got was abandonment in the sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. This is the fruit of that bad idea. John, we have a few minutes left, and I want to talk about a piece that ran at Christianity Today this week. They've been running a series, I think once per week. They're publishing somebody's opinion piece over there about how to approach schooling for their kids. So they've had somebody write about their decision to homeschool their kids. Someone has written about sending their kids to a private school and a Christian school. And then this week, and this is the piece that I think by far has gotten the most attention, they published a piece from a mom who said her kids are not in school yet, but that she and her husband have decided to send their kids to public school. And I'm just going to read a quote this kind of sums up her reasoning here. Quote, think of it like strength training. Your children need to build muscles of faith, and public school can provide weight to lift while you're around to spot them. Let them wrestle with worldly counter narratives to God's truth while they're still under your care. Your impressions of this piece?
Well, listen, I think it is important to note that CT has run multiple pieces from multiple people with these multiple perspectives, because the way it went out on social media was essentially Christianity Today is endorsing public schooling.
Right.
And I think that's an important correction to note, that they are throwing them all out. That said, this piece was very, very weak. It was very, very weak on a number of levels. When this piece was challenged, the author actually came back and said, I was just arguing from my own experience. First of all, she hasn't had that experience. And secondly, that's not what an argument is. That's an assertion. And that is not actually an argument for this. These are all hypothetical things. Look, I want to say up front, there are incredible Christians that are still in the public school system as teachers, as administrators, and that sort of stuff all over America. And some of them are really doing some innovative and unique things. We've talked about LifeWise Academy actually coming alongside public schools and providing some, release time instruction. And this is something you can bring to your state and your school, and you should check out LifeWise Academy. We have, folks, that are really trying hard, and they see this as their mission field. If an adult sees public education as their mission field, I'm all for it. I want to give them as many resources as possible. You do not put a 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old as a missionary. That's just not what they do. And the way to do a workout to use that is to expose kids to alternative ideas and to do it under your care. But an adult being a missionary is completely different than expecting a 6 or 7 or 8-year-old to be a missionary. That's just not what they're equipped to do. Could it be a workout? Maybe. There are a lot of other ways to do it, and that also involve grounding them in the truth. The problem is I think that there is a kind of philosophy of education here, of outsourcing, that is embraced in this piece, and a normality, and this shouldn't be normal. There is one of the things that's infecting our judgment on this, and I want to say this really careful, because I do know that there are wonderful teachers. This week on Bill Maher's show, there was this kind of really robust discussion about how public education is failing. And then in the middle, he's like, but we know public school teachers are heroes. There is this sense in which we have to justify this narrative that all public school teachers are great and they're underpaid and all. And this, I think, you can never question the system, is completely upside down. This summer, I met a set of parents from a school district outside of Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids is historically this super conservative, quaint little town. This is even a smaller town where everybody knows everybody. And these parents knew this teacher, and knew the teachers and the school counselors and that sort of stuff. They'd gone to ice cream together, all kinds of things. They had come up with a learning plan for their daughter who has autism. And then they find out by a mistake from the school. And what I mean by that is a typo, where the school sent home the wrong records, which refer to their daughter with boy pronouns and a boy name. In other words, they sent the internal records. The school was keeping 2 sets of records that were internal and records that were supposed to be visible to the parents. That's how they found out that these people, they thought that they were their friends and that they were engaged and highly involved and, doing all the spotting, as this article put it, were actually transing their kid without their knowledge. The level of betrayal and abandonment is stunning. The same school district now has doubled down on their policy on this gender stuff. Look, we're not dealing with neutrality here. We're not dealing with, people playing fair. There's a level, and this is Michigan. This isn't Massachusetts or LA. You have to understand the worldviews at work here are so dramatically overbearing. This is a systemic problem. I've been on record saying I believe in systemic evil. There are systemic evils in this system And again, I'm not saying that there are no great teachers. I'm not saying there are no great Christian schools. And listen, missionaries go to places where there's great evil and systemic evil all the time. God bless them. I want to support them. I'll point you to Gateways to Better Education, which does a great job helping Christian public school teachers know what they can and can't do by rights, and better have ADF and First Liberty on speed dial. But listen, we're not dealing with the world that this author thinks we're dealing with when we're dealing with public education.
That was my impression. I thought this piece was written for like 1992. If the assertion is that people who won't send their kids to public school, like me, that my chief concern is that my daughters are going to get teased for loving Jesus, or, their teacher's going to have a Sam Harris poster in their room and they're going to say Christianity is dumb.
Those were the good old days.
That is frankly quaint. Right? That is very cute. That's almost nobody's concern. My concern chiefly, I will be honest with you, is that if I sent my kids to public school, they're not going to learn how to read. And that concern is material for just about every, at least a majority of public school districts. So I don't even have to say that this is just my context or my experience or my public school district. This is a majority of public school districts at this point. Like the scale has tipped. 32% of American fourth graders in the public school system are literate. That's according to the last Nation's report card that they put out every 2 years. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, but that is connected to the ideological question as well, because
that's what they're spending all their time.
Well, but not just
right?
that.
I mean, that's exactly right.
It would be incredibly naive to assume that if you have a school that's going to suggest to kids that, boys can be girls and also cats, and, we're going to do a land acknowledgement. And instead of, the Pledge of Allegiance, and we can't teach algebra because it's racist and whatever. Why would you assume that they're teaching your kids anything true at all? Right? If that is the chief concern. I want my kids to actually be educated. I'm not worried about them being teased for being Christian. And honestly, too, I think it's also quaint to assume that most Christian schools in the country, or private schools for that matter, are sheltering kids from, counter narratives to God's truth, which, by the way, there is a word for that, and the word is lies. And I'm sitting here reading this piece thinking, I don't want my kid, I'm not sending my kids to public school or private school because I want to make sure they learn the Old Testament. It is a profound benefit if that's getting reinforced at school, because I'm also teaching them that at home. I want them to learn geology and calculus and algebra, because all of those things are God's truth too. And if public schools aren't teaching them real biology, then why would I have any imagination they're going to teach them real science? And the scores bear this out. They are not teaching them.
Look, that point is so important about which was also embedded, is that the other alternatives are equivalent to sheltering. Look, the test scores don't show this. You meet these kids, they don't show this. If you want to meet a kid who really understands kind of how the world works and what is true, and also the other side, I can introduce you to an awful lot of homeschoolers and private school kids who can do that. Now, I'm not saying they're all that way. Look, I think there are tons of Christian schools in America, private Christian schools, who aim at mediocrity and don't hit it. That's the case. But you know what? That's been the test scores and the results of public education now for a long time. It's in so many ways a failed system, and we defend it as if it's untouchable. And that's what was so kind of, I think bizarre. This author is just not writing in reality in terms of what the system is. And again, can a Christian parent, utilize a public school resource? Colorado, for example, you can actually pick and choose and piece together educations and, take the best of this and take the best of that. And that's frankly the way we've proceeded as parents with our kids. And we're pretty happy with, what's happening. I think all of that can be done. Let me add one more factor. In addition to what you said about the narrative that Christian schools and private schools and all non-public options are somehow these sheltering academic, secondary places, which isn't true. And in addition to the reality that we're not just talking about kids being made fun of, we're talking about an all-out assault on their worldview.
And education.
You now have a systemic problem where this is state officials inserting themselves between children and parents. So that's the other part of this. That's the Michigan story. That's not an isolated story that's happening again on the coast.
I will just say too, this is also why we can't lay the blame, and I do not, and I know you don't either, at the feet of every public school teacher. Obviously, there are there are some, but also a lot of these teachers are being expected by the state to do things that they should not be expected. They're social workers at this point. I mean, going back to the issue in Springfield here, the teachers of the public school here are expected to help these families with their health care and with their, food benefits. And the system is not working.
And you need to understand, in education programs and college campuses, where these teachers are trained, they are oftentimes taught because of these so-called LGBTQ experts to insert themselves between children and their parents. I saw just this week, and I don't want to, name names or name schools or anything like that, where a Christian college who has decided that the most noble thing for their education department to do is to train teachers for public schools, brought in the same sort of training to train all of their faculty at a Christian college on how to insert themselves between, quote unquote, Christian college, I'll say that, between children and their parents. And that wasn't just for the education department. That was for the entire faculty of this school. But I'll take you to thought leaders on Christian college campuses all over America, where these programs are designed to train public school teachers, which means they have to go by the public school, standards and accreditation standards and so on. This stuff is being inserted at the very beginning. So if you have a great public school teacher, and again, I'm saying Christians see this as their mission field, run into it. You can't support the system. The system itself is not defensible. Yeah, it got me riled up too. And
same.
But I want to be clear. Like, your experience is not an argument. There's not even an experience here behind these. This was rehashed old stuff that's just not true. It hasn't been true for years. I'm not even sure 1992 is back far enough.
I do have a piece. I'll just say quickly, I do have a piece coming out in World Opinions next week, just in response to this piece. If you couldn't tell, I was a little fired up about it. I empathize with the impulse because I had the same impulse when I was newly married. Aaron and I used to say that we will send our kids to public school. We both went to public schools. We had challenging experiences, but they were great. They were formative, all of the above. But then when it did come time to send our kids, we looked at the stats in our local public school district, but we also saw what was happening nationally and thought, there's no way. So just look for that next week. Okay, let's do recommendations really fast. John,
wait, that's not your recommendation? I feel like you just recommended your recommendation.
I was just we will link to that piece I mentioned earlier in the show from Substack, where the New Yorker writer was talking about people numbing out, because it is really, really incredible to see somebody, again, on the outside of our Christian worldview, coming to some of these same conclusions. And it was really well written. So her name is Catherine Shannon, and we'll include a link to that. But
I will not recommend the Slate piece about people making fun of 9/11, or even link to it. It's not even worth reading. It was just interesting. My recommendation again is a book by Garrett Graff called The Only Plane in the Sky. It really is a remarkable work. It is a collection of oral reports from people, famous people, the politicians, and just everyday people on the ground crew. When you remember Air Force One landed, I think, in the middle of Kansas. And I mean, it's just a incredible piece, and it's basically called An Oral History of 9/11. And it's comprehensive. I mean, it's just captivating, and letting other people speak in this way and pulling it together is very, very incredible. You have people that were in the towers. You have firefighters. You have telephone operators, chaplains. I'm just, kind of going back through teachers that evacuated children from schools near the World Trade Center, generals at the Pentagon, the president, the vice president. And it's just woven in a timeline. It's just a remarkable work. And, the whole never forget, there is a cultural memory is incredibly important to cultural stability. This is a piece that I would recommend.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's going to do it for the show. Thanks so much for listening to Breakpoint this week. I'm Maria Baer alongside John Stonestreet, and we'll see you all next week.